This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.
Welcome to the Fatigue Fixer podcast. Have you ever wondered why you and most of the women you know seem tired so much of the time? Well, this is the podcast where we explore why. I'm here to help you better understand how your body works, whether we're talking about heavy, painful periods, why you have to pee all the time, or what the heck is happening to your body through perimenopause. And I'm not afraid to shed light on conversations that I feel we need to be having out in the open. Like, why are so many women struggling with irritability and anger, drinking more alcohol, and injecting our faces with Botox and fillers in an attempt to stay young? I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Vadeboncoeur. I'm a naturopathic doctor, mom, fatigue fixer, and loud and outspoken woman who's fascinated by the state of modern women's health and well-being. I know that you, yes, you, are incredible, and I want you to have the energy you need to share your unique gifts with the world because we are in desperate need of more female leadership. So join me for conversations that will help you feel less alone, more informed about all the things that might be draining your energy, and inspired to fix your fatigue and wake up every morning feeling rested and excited for the day ahead. I can't wait to share today's episode with you, so let's get into it. We have a running joke in my house that when I open the cupboard around 8 p.m., my partner asks, "Is it time for your medicine?" My medicine is dark chocolate. I love it, it makes me happy, and I often feel pulled to it at the end of a long day. Now here's the thing, I'm not eating chocolate to fill a physical hunger need. I'm eating it because it makes me happy and it feels so good to eat it. Maybe your go-to is popcorn or chips or candy. And maybe like me, there's always a part of your brain that feels just a little bit guilty or like you're being bad when you eat these foods. Maybe you spend all day trying to avoid thinking about eating certain foods, but by the end of the day, you're exhausted and you need a little pick-me-up. And you find yourself with a bowl of chips that somehow magically landed in your lap. Here's a big spoiler alert. You are an emotional eater. We are all emotional eaters. But that's not necessarily the bad thing that diet culture has made it out to be. This is the one where you're hungry for more. And today we're going to explore the difference between physical hunger, taste cravings, and emotional hunger, and help you better understand what's driving your hunger. Because if you're anything like me, what you're really hungry for is probably more time, more energy, more calm, more excitement. And I couldn't be more excited to welcome back our guest today, Dr. Jenn Salib Huber. Dr. Jenn Salib Huber is a Canadian Registered Dietitian, Naturopathic Doctor, and intuitive eating counselor, and she's on a mission to help women manage menopause without diets and food rules. She helps women navigate the physical and emotional changes that happen in perimenopause and menopause, including their search for food freedom and body confidence. Working from a health at every size approach, she teaches women to become intuitive eaters and build body confidence at any stage of midlife. In addition to her one-on-one and group programs, she is the host of an excellent podcast, the Midlife Feast, and community that helps women undiet their lives after 40 so they can nourish a relationship with food that helps them to discover the magic of midlife. If you are new to the podcast or you haven't listened to episode 1, the one where your pants don't fit, please go back and listen to our conversation about body changes in midlife. It is the most downloaded episode of the podcast that we've done so far. So Jenn, welcome back to the podcast. I'm so happy to have you here again.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to talk about this. And I'm honored that the first podcast was so popular.
It was. I got a lot of really good feedback from that episode. So before we dive in, we have to get the most important question out of the way, which is, what is your go-to feel-good snack? What are you reaching for in the cupboard at 8 p.m. at night?
I'm a salty person. So I'm definitely like the chip, cracker, salted nuts, maybe with a few like peanut M&Ms thrown in. But yeah, salt is my go-to for sure.
Nice. I'm definitely more of a sweet tooth than a salty girl. Part of what really made me want to do this episode is in one of your emails, and you send wonderful emails. Everyone should go and join Jenn's email list. You sent out this algorithm of emotional hunger. And it's something that I think is going to be so helpful for our listeners, for us to walk through. And that's really what prompted me to want to have this conversation with you. And one of the things that I've really been noticing and exploring is that one of the ways that I know diet culture is still well and alive inside of me is how I question my hunger. And how for example, I'll often eat like a full plate of dinner, and then an hour or two later, I'm like, I am still legitimately physically hungry. And then I go into this whole conversation in my head, like, why am I still hungry? How can I still be hungry? I ate dinner. Like this whole story that I make up. And I think there's so much emphasis in diet culture and in wellness on trying to like suppress and manage our hunger, as if being hungry is like a mortal sin, right? It's like, I was thinking about this morning as I was preparing for this, like how many men brag about how much they can eat. Like they're so proud of their appetites. And meanwhile, we are conditioned to like be dainty and not eat too much and not like, and I think it's about so much more than food, which is why I want to have this conversation. Like the fact that we try to control and suppress our physical appetite, I also think shows up in the ways that we try to control and suppress our hunger for other things in life and our other desires. So I know one of the principles of intuitive eating is challenging the food police. So can you talk to our listeners, like, who is the food police? Who are they? And what do they look like? What do they sound like for most women in real life?
So the food police can either live in your head, they can live in your house, or they can be dictated to you. So you can be assigned food police, for example, based on, whatever diet du jour you're following. And so essentially the food police enforce the rules, either that you've given yourself or feel that you need to follow. So when we're food policing, we're always filtering through, is this right? Is this wrong? Am I eating good food? Bad? Have I had enough? Not too much? So it's kind of this idea that there's one way. I mean, laws are right or wrong, black and white. And we have this relationship with food, thanks to diet and wellness culture, that make us believe that there's one right way to do something. And so with hunger, like you were saying, we're very much conditioned and programmed to believe that being hungry is a problem. So when you experience a lot of physical hunger, you might feel that that's a problem. But really what it is it's kind of a check engine light that either you're not eating enough, because if you're always hungry, it means that you're undernourishing. But if it's not physical hunger, it still is a valid hunger. It is still a sign or a symptom that there's something, a need that isn't being met. So when I'm working with people who have dieted their whole lives, they either are terrified of hunger because it means that they have to make a decision about food. And these aren't people with clinical eating disorders. These are just chronic dieters that have either, followed rules and policing around eating every 2 hours, or they're doing, fasting and trying not to eat for as long as possible. But really what we're trying to do with intuitive eating is quiet the food police, put them in their corner, get them out of the house so that you can actually listen to how do you experience hunger? What does it feel like? And where is it coming from?
Yeah. I've been paying much closer attention to both my physical and my emotional hunger. And it's been really interesting to notice how, for me personally, I find hunger deeply uncomfortable, like physical hunger. I don't like being hungry. And so that's something that I've noticed about myself. And like you said, when I am still physically hungry after dinner, all it means is that I haven't fueled enough.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean I'm a bad person and that I'm who knows, like it literally just means my body needs more fuel and more food than I have given it so far today.
Yep. And so many people, when they have that experience of, oh my gosh, I just ate, why am I hungry?
Yes.
They CSI their last meal and they're like, okay, how much protein, how much fiber, when did I last eat, what did I do? And they're trying to really make up this magic around why it wasn't good, what they're going to do differently next time, without just considering that this is just normal. This is what your body does. Would we do the same thing about going to the bathroom? If I had to pee an hour after I peed, would I like CSI how much water I drank? I wouldn't. And so we really need to remember that hunger is a physiological, biological cue. That's all.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that you're a bad person or you're doing anything wrong. Now, that also doesn't mean that you can't look at it as, a check engine light. If you're always hungry, that's a cue of what needs to happen. If you have a lot of appetite, meaning you're interested in eating, but it's not necessarily tied to those physical hunger cues of maybe feeling tired or your stomach rumbling, that's also a cue that there's something that is driving this interest in eating because eating feels good. So whenever we talk about emotional hunger and emotional eating, the first thing I always do is depathologize it. Every single human is an emotional eater. Everybody.
Yes.
Because eating feels good. So if we are experiencing uncomfortable feelings, and especially if those feelings are being driven by stress, for example, and that sympathetic nervous system is being activated, one of the ways that we can actually tip, the balance of that response is by eating, because eating anything stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system, which is why when you're really stressed, now some people, when they get so stressed, they actually don't want to eat at all. And that's kind of, you're really starting to get to the top of that distress scale. But if you're in the, oh my gosh, I'm worried about something, I'm thinking about something, or I'm, have that anticipatory anxiety, eating will feel good in that moment. It will give you a moment of comfort, but it's also not going to fix it. So, but what happens is that people will just beat themselves up for wanting to eat when they're stressed and feel like if they can manage their diet perfectly or avoid sugar or avoid whatever, that they won't ever feel that craving to eat when they're not hungry. And that's just simply not the case. So if we just start with the baseline that every single human being is an emotional eater, where can we go from there in a more compassionate and attuned way? Because food needs to be part of your self-care toolbox, but it shouldn't be the only tool. Because if it's the only tool, it's not going to fix every problem, because there isn't a multi-tool that is going to fix every problem.
Yes. And we're going to get into that because that's such a big part of it. I think the other thing is that just like we talked about when we talked about bodies changing, appetites also are going to change. Yeah. So I have been exercising much more intensely and much more regularly than I have in the past. So that could be part of why I'm hungrier.
Absolutely.
I'm using my body more. And I think the connection with stress is so important because I've made multiple changes, including quitting alcohol, which I talked about in a previous episode. And I've noticed for me, like multiple signs that my nervous system is calming down. And it was actually my therapist. I was telling him, I'm like, I'm really hungry. And he's like, maybe because your nervous system is more relaxed. And it actually is. And I was like, yes, that totally makes sense. So being hungry is not always a bad thing. Like it could actually just be a sign that you're more relaxed and that your body is in a state where it needs more fuel for whatever reason. So
yeah, and when we're in a relaxed state, our parasympathetic nervous system is also moving food through kind of in that regular motion, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, that absolutely makes sense.
Yeah. So let's walk through this roadmap or this algorithm. So the first question that you encourage people to think about when you feel hunger is to ask yourself, am I physically hungry?
Yeah.
That's where we start.
That's where we start.
If the answer is yes, so if you are seeing signs of physical hunger, The answer is eat more food.
Yeah. And I always like to clarify too that physical hunger is a spectrum that not everyone experiences in the same way. And most people wait for what they think is, or what they've been told is being hungry enough, which for a lot of people is actually past the point of comfortable hunger. So if I wait for my stomach to grumble, I am much closer to uncomfortable hunger, or what we call primal hunger, than I am comfortable hunger. So if I'm comfortably hungry, my stomach definitely feels empty. It's probably been a few hours since I've had a meal. I'm interested in food. So I'm thinking, oh, what time is it? Is it lunchtime? I'm thinking about what I'm going to have. I'm looking forward to it. But I'm not uncomfortable. So when I'm in that space of comfortable hunger, I can choose mindfully. I can choose intuitively. I'm not in a panic. I'm not in a rush. I'm going to eat my meal in a relaxed way. And I can also be intentional. So I use the example, the first time that I ever really noticed how this affected me when I was living in Nova Scotia and working in a clinic. You know, we had a fridge and I would bring my lunch most days. And I was really, really bad at planning my lunches. In that planning to take a lunch, I always packed something that I could eat quickly in between patients. We're all guilty of that. But what would happen though, is that if I got to that uncomfortable hunger stage, I would be much more likely to forget the lunch or choose not to eat the lunch that I brought and go 2 doors up the street to buy something, because my brain would tell me that that was faster. Even though it wasn't going to be as satisfying or as filling most of the time. So recognizing that if you're waiting until you're hungry enough, you may be past the point of being able to choose mindfully and intuitively. So I wanted to just add that about hunger.
Yeah. Well, and the way that I kind of position this with patients is I'm like, do you get hangry? And they're like, oh, yes. I'm like, if you are hangry, you probably should have eaten 30 to 60 minutes ago. Yeah. You waited too long. So if you experience hanger, that's usually a sign that you are waiting too long. Yeah. But can you drop the word primal hunger? And I would love for you to explain what that is.
So when we get primally hungry, essentially this, it's when we're hangry. It's another kind of word for hangry. And so when we get hangry, we are not thinking beyond what can I eat right now? And so it's very difficult to notice your food, to enjoy your food, and you really don't care what you're eating. So I describe it as the point where you're going to knock down old ladies and small children to get to food, right? And so you don't want to be in that place of you have to drop everything to eat. And what's also happening is kind of this alarm system, right? So if we think about that stress reaction, so if our blood sugar drops, cortisol levels, which is a stress hormone, goes up to help mobilize stores of energy to keep your blood sugar up. And while all of that is happening, your brain is saying, hey, can we just ignore everything else? We're like running out of gas here. So if you're trying to prioritize anything else in your life, but you're getting hangry on a regular basis, you are not doing any of those things probably very well, because you're in this constant state of responding to an almost emergency.
Yeah. I love that you bring this up, because most women that I work with are mindful of stress. They're really trying to reduce their stress. And I think most of us have not made the connection that our eating patterns can be one of the biggest stressors on our brain. Because like you said, our brain needs a steady stream of glucose to do all the amazing things that it does. If it starts to see that there is not enough glucose and it's going to run out of energy, it is going to freak out and release, like you said, this cascade of stress hormones. So we are often adding so much stress simply by how, like, the timing of our eating and how we often ignore those early signs and we wait for that catastrophic, like, I'm going to eat the first thing I see because I feel like I'm going to pass out. We're adding to our stress. So this is, if you are listening and one of your goals is to reduce your stress, this is one of the simplest ways is just eat regular meals and don't wait too late. Don't wait till that point where you're hangry and you're going to knock over the old lady for her cookies. Like, don't wait for that. Just eat sooner than that.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I think makes this difficult for a lot of women is that we're not good at recognizing the early signs of hunger. And I think part of that is that many of us through diet culture have jumped through hoops to not feel hungry and to just eat according to someone else's rules. But also, I think many of us, especially when we get distracted at work and we're head down and doing 100 things, our body is not in a state where we're going to easily recognize some of those hunger cues. So what are some of the things that get in the way of us noticing maybe those earlier hunger cues?
Yeah. And so we call them attunement disruptors. So in intuitive eating, we talk about attunement being that process of being able to listen and respond, and then attunement disruptors. This is an analogy that only people over kind of 40 would probably get. But, you know, if you remember being in a car that had a dial for the radio, if you were in between towns or cities, you could almost get the next signal. And as long as everything was quiet, you could still mostly hear the song. But if there was any noise, you couldn't. And so what's happening when we are busy and we're distracted and maybe stressed is that we're not hearing something until we're right on the dial. And we're also very used to ignoring those first signs. So a lot of people don't realize until I actually go through this exercise with them that, oh, I actually reach for a coffee every day at 11 o'clock. Oh, well, when did you have breakfast? 6:30. But it's too early for lunch, so I'm not going to have lunch yet. I'm just going to have a coffee. I'm like, well, that's 5.5 hours later. You need to eat, right?
Yeah.
And so even just that sometimes is enough to bring awareness that, I had no idea, because we're also programmed to believe that we should only be hungry at like 8, 12, and 5.
Totally.
And so many people will think, well, if I'm hungry 3 hours after I've eaten, it's not time yet. Or I need to wait longer. And so when we start ignoring those cues, of course, hunger can kind of get calmed down for a little while, especially if you have something like coffee. Caffeine's an appetite suppressant. Some people will have water. We have stretch receptors in our stomach, which are part of that fullness cascade. But it's kind of like a false signal because they're kind of like the first tripwire. It's like, oh, food is coming. These stretch receptors are growing. Okay, great. That means we're eating. So for like 10 or 20 minutes, that can work. But when your brain is like, what happened to this shipment of food that you told me I was getting? Then the hunger signals come back, and often stronger. And often you kind of dive right into primal hunger. So what I tell people to notice is, when you start to think about reaching for a coffee, or when you start to notice mental fatigue if you're working, when you start to notice what other people are eating. So if I've just had a meal and I'm full and satisfied, I won't really notice if someone is eating next to me because I'm not interested in eating. But if all of a sudden I'm like, oh, what is that smell? Did somebody just cook something? That might be a cue that, oh, I might be getting hungry. So a lot of it is just paying attention to what's happening. What are those attunement disruptors? And if you actually start to notice it, you probably are getting smoke signals from your brain and body that you need a refueling long before that 5 alarm goes off.
So I think we're saying stress is definitely an attunement disruptor, like stress or distraction. Yep. I know you've talked in the past about alcohol being an attunement disruptor. Yes, are there other big ones that we haven't touched on?
Well, I mean, the hormone piece always comes up because people say, oh, I feel so much hungrier.
Yes.
And, you know, I think that there is absolutely a relationship there. But is it caused by the hormones, or is it part of the whirlpool of stuff that gets sucked into the hormone changes? So if you're not sleeping, that increases your appetite and increases your appetite for quick energy foods. So sleep can be an attunement disruptor. We do know that estrogen and progesterone do play into, have metabolic roles. So estrogen seems to have a bit more of an appetite suppressant effect. And I hate using that word because it's not like going on hormone therapy is going to magically suppress your appetite, just to be clear about that. But we do know if we look at information on appetite over the menstrual cycle, there's more appetite in the second half. But we also know that progesterone increases energy needs in the second half. So is it, which came first, the chicken or the egg?
Yeah.
And also then the emotional hunger created by some of the mood changes of perimenopause and menopause, which we can't ignore. So there are many attunement disruptors involved in that whirlpool of perimenopause. But I would say that often the impact on our hunger, both physical and emotional, is a byproduct of those and not a direct effect of the hormone changes.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, because there's such a trend right now to blame perimenopause hormone and cortisol. Cortisol is the boogeyman of the day, that all of our problems are caused by these hormones. And what you said is so important. The hormones themselves are not often directly contributing either to weight gain or appetite or whatever's going on, but they have a huge impact on how you feel.
Yeah.
And how you feel is going to have a huge impact. As we work through this algorithm, you're going to see there's lots of different emotional states that are going to make us reach for food as a way to feel better. Okay.
So one of the other things, just because I wanted to touch on this, that you brought up about how you're working out more, you're going to the gym, and that you're making that connection that you might be hungrier. This is a really common thing that I see, especially now that we're having a lot more strength training conversations, that people will say, hey, I'm lifting weights for the first time, but I can't get my nutrition right because I'm always hungry. But really, they have only adjusted their protein. So they'll say, yeah, I'm having that extra protein shake, or I'm, getting a few extra grams of protein, but that is not enough to really kind of nourish not only the muscles that you're building, but the energy that still needs to be used by your body the rest of the day. So I think it's so important for people to expect to be hungrier and not to think that they're doing something wrong.
Yeah. And I think it also goes back to, we need to reframe why we're exercising, because if your main goal of why you're exercising is weight loss, you are going to be so reluctant to eat more. My goal right now is to be strong so that I can carry my groceries when I'm 80 years old. Like that's
what I say. I love that too.
Yeah, that is my goal. So my goal is not to drop weight on the scale. In fact, I am at my heaviest weight I've ever been. So if that was what I was using to measure my progress, it would be a quote unquote failure, but it's not, because I'm lifting weight that I have never lifted in my life. I am seeing physically that I look stronger and I feel stronger. And that is my goal. So if I need to eat more in order to be strong and stay strong, then that is what I need to do.
Yeah.
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 Okay.
Totally.
So we're hungry. We stop and we say, am I physically hungry? If the answer is a visible, noticeable yes, you need to eat some food. If you're not sure, you do some of the things that we talked about, checking in, asking how long ago did I eat? If it's been more than 3 hours, checking in, are there signs of hunger? If the answer is yes, again, please eat some food. If the answer is no, I am not physically hungry, then this is where you encourage us to press pause and to try to identify the emotion or feeling. So how do we practically press pause? How do we do this?
And this is a tricky one, because you have this flow chart. It looks like it's just a step on the flow chart. But when I'm working with people and we talk about this, I can almost immediately sense a fear of pressing pause means no. So for many, many people, you can't even step into the idea of pressing pause until you've done some work on your relationship with food. If you are a lifelong dieter, lifelong emotional eater, you will not be able to just follow this like an IKEA diagram. This is not like step 1, step 2, step 3. But if it feels like, you're in this place where you might be able to press pause and you don't internally have a freak out, what we're doing is really just trying to be attuned to what is it that I'm feeling. So to back up a little bit, we've talked about physical hunger. There's another type of hunger called taste hunger. Taste hunger is I want to eat it because I know it tastes good. Yeah. So that could be thinking about food that tastes good. That could be walking by a bakery. That could be whatever it is. Diet culture likes to call that tricky hunger, but I think it's a fantastic barometer to satisfaction. So because it helps you to know what you want.
Yeah.
And so emotional hunger is the strong, intense desire and interest in eating in the absence of physical hunger that is driven by almost like a compulsion. And so, this isn't this, we're not talking about a binge eating disorder. We're just talking about, oh, I want that now. So physical hunger tends to come on slowly, builds over time. Emotional hunger is like immediate. Ooh, that's what I want, and I want it now. So, but it can be driven by negative emotions. So we can have stress, we can have sadness, we can have anger, all of those things driving that, because again, eating is pleasurable. And what we want in those moments is a moment of pleasure, which is normal, totally normal. But it can also be driven by joy. Like that's where sometimes people get tripped up. They'll be like, I don't eat when I'm sad. I eat when I'm happy. But again, eating is pleasurable. And so we can make all kinds of associations with foods. And sometimes we will still want to eat that in that moment, and this is where the permission and staying out of the scarcity mindset is so important. Because if you go into this exercise, this flow chart, this work with the intention of stopping every moment of emotional hunger, you will put yourself in a scarcity mindset that will make you want it 10 times more.
Absolutely.
So it has to come from this curiosity place. So you mentioned 8 o'clock every night, you find yourself in the kitchen. And so if you were applying this curiosity to it, it's like, oh, well, why am I here? Well, I guess I want this moment of pleasure. And it's totally normal. That's what people do, right?
I can tell you exactly why I'm there. I'm there because I just put my son to bed. I have been parenting for more than 12 hours, and I want a reward because now it is my time to have pleasure and relaxation and downtime before I go to bed. So I know exactly what's driving it.
Absolutely. So, and that moment of pleasure, that end of the day thing, there's nothing wrong with that.
No.
And again, when we talk about self-care toolboxes, which is one of the things that, I love helping people to do, is to be able to recognize, okay, this is emotional hunger. Are there patterns, places, people, things, that are common triggers? Are there feelings that you can recognize that are on the lather, rinse, repeat cycle? And can we press pause long enough and in a safe enough way to actually try on something else? Because the way that our brain, and I find this so fascinating, but so our brain likes to, is on this avoid pain, seek pleasure pathway. And if you have only ever batted 100, every time that you feel this emotion, you reach for food, your brain is saying, hey, this works great. I have zero motivation to change this. And we don't want to create more discomfort by withholding it, because then that makes you want it more. What we want to do is try something else on, keep trying things on until we find something that is like, oh yeah, that wasn't bad. That was okay. So that the next time that emotion rolls around, you're not batting 100 anymore. And your brain is like, oh, that didn't work this time? Oh, what was the thing that worked last time? Let's go back and try that again. And so that neural pruning that happens every time we lay down new tracks and pathways to respond to situations takes practice, and it cannot be driven by negative emotions. So if you were trying to, white knuckle your way out of this reactive eating habit that has served you for many years, it's not going to work. So really staying in that neutral, hey, I'm just here to see what's going on. I'm going to try this, I'm going to try that, and I'm not at all going to be emotionally attached to the outcome. I'm just trying to see what happens. That takes practice, and it takes trust, and it takes practice, but it works once you have the right tools in your toolbox.
Yeah. And I want to get back to the toolbox because I think that's so important. I also think I love this idea of like just bringing more curiosity and compassion to our eating journey or our health journey. Like you said, I think so many of us have this expectation that we need to do it in a very like rigid and strict and perfect way. And that is not how our bodies work. Your hunger is going to be different from day to day. Your emotions are going to be different. So just be curious. And when things work, that's information and feedback. And when things don't work, it's also just information and feedback. It's not a failure and a sign that you are a terrible, horrible person. It just, we put so much like morality on these things, which is so unnecessary. So,
Yeah.
so once we realize that we're not physically hungry and we press pause, and I love that, we're not saying we're not going to meet this need with food. We're just saying we're going to just take a moment to check in to see if food is what we want, or maybe there's something else, or maybe it's food and something else, right?
Exactly.
You can do both. So one of the things I love is you kind of break down the emotional needs into two categories. One is, do I need soothing or do I need stimulation? And I think this is such a great question and a great maybe starting place when you are feeling that emotional hunger to check in. Do I need soothing? Am I feeling stressed and overwhelmed and anxious and I need to calm down? Or do I need am I exhausted and bored and lonely and I need like a pick me up, or I need something to stimulate me? So I think that's a great place to start. And
because
then,
you don't want to feel like you have to do this Freudian deep dive into your entire life to understand your emotional hunger.
Yeah.
There can be patterns, obviously, that you have learned from your family of origin and all of that kind of stuff. But at the same time, a lot of this need for either soothing or stimulation is just how we're built. And, again, we're really good at making habits and we're really good at laying down those repeating cycles if they work. So if you have been bored 1,000 times and 1,000 times you've had something to eat and you're less bored, your brain is going to be like, yeah, we're batting 100. So why do you want me to change that? It's not broken for me. So we really need to just understand, like, this is how our brain works. And it's not a moral failing. It's just simply how our brain works. And when you can really see that neutrally, without judgment, without feeling broken or feeling like there's something wrong with you, I think it becomes exciting to explore and be curious about how else can I respond to this feeling.
And I think that ties in one of the other principles of intuitive eating, which is coping with your emotions with kindness.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Not being so hard on yourself. If you're feeling tired or bored or anxious, it's all just feedback. And again, the more you can learn to be curious and compassionate about how you're feeling. And I also think part of what ties into this is that most of us are really uncomfortable sitting with anger. We don't like sitting with anxiety. So part of it is also just acknowledging that these things are uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And how can we start to get comfortable feeling these things that don't feel good? Because a lot of times when we actually let ourselves feel whatever there is to be felt, it actually passes pretty quickly.
Yeah. And we have to get better at also labeling it. So I love how Brene Brown calls it emotional granularity.
Yes.
We really have to get down to it and label it, because if we can, it's like 283 emotions or something.
Yeah.
If we can actually label it, we are much more likely to be able to find a solution in the moment, but also recognizing patterns in the future. And, when we call it stress, well, what is it? Is it just stress, or is it stress about not knowing the outcome? Is it stress about not having control? Is it stress that's actually anger that you're calling stress because you can't change it and you're in a situation that you can't change? Like, what actually is driving the emotional hunger? Because all three of those situations will have different toolboxes, right?
So let's talk about the toolbox. So let's say that you do your check-in and you realize you're tired. One of the things you say is like, go lay down for 15 minutes, right?
Yep.
So it's all about using or exploring non-food tools to help you meet your actual need. That's right?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And if we've identified that you're not hungry and it's been less than 3 hours since you've eaten, and especially if you feel like you had a meal that would typically meet your physical hunger needs, being able to have access to those tools. So if you can't lay down and have a nap, but you have a private space, laying down and legs up the wall, is one of my favorite things.
So
right?
good. So good.
It's so good. Like you just have to have that feeling once of actually, feeling the blood rush back into your body. It's so good.
Yes.
But even if you're not going to sleep, just laying down, giving ourselves permission. I mean, you talk to people all day long about fatigue, and I'm sure you hear the same as I do. The expectation that you can get up at 5 a.m. and go until 11 o'clock at night and not feel tired in the afternoon is unrealistic.
Totally.
And sometimes those hours happen for reasons you can't control. But if you have the opportunity to lay down, do it. I haven't been sleeping well because it's been so hot. And yesterday I took a 20-minute nap. Perfect, right? It's all I needed. And so just having that permission and curiosity, like, what can I do? If I can't have a full-blown nap, can I just lay down? Can I just close my eyes?
Yeah. This is where I would also throw in yoga nidra is one of my, like my mid-afternoon 15-minute yoga nidra. It's it's better than a nap. It's so good. I love it too. Perfect reset. Yeah. Okay.
But one of the things is that when you're building your self-care toolbox is you need to have this list of things accessible because you don't want to use up capacity and energy thinking in those moments. So I suggest that people keep a list on their phone of quick 15-minute things that they can do. So one of the things that I love is the New York Times games.
Same.
And so I save those because it takes me about 15 minutes to do them all. I save them either for like in the morning if I feel like I want that first thing, or in the afternoon when my kids are in school before they get home. That's kind of one of my favorite things. I love tea. I have an embarrassing amount of tea in my house, but I love it because it allows me to just open up this cupboard and say, what do I feel like having? So making a cup of tea, sometimes with a snack, sometimes without. Reading. So I love to read. I always have a book on the go, reading a chapter, about 15 minutes most of the time. This can be gardening. Some people find weeding really,
I love so therapeutic, pulling weeds.
So just having this ongoing list, and you just add to it over time, right? So that you can actually have this quick access and you start to notice, okay, what is it that I'm like reaching for in this toolbox most of the time? And that really helps you to refine what's working and what is getting in the way of that batting average that we were talking about earlier.
And I think you talked a bit about this earlier, but I think it's so important to circle back to is that what's driving so much of this emotional hunger is a desire for pleasure.
Yeah.
And sadly, for a lot of people, food is one of the only, and sometimes the only real source of pleasure that we have in our day.
Yeah.
So again, instead of looking at emotional eating as this sign that you're a failure or you're a bad person, it is just a sign that your body wants and needs pleasure. And again, can you bring curiosity and look at what are some of the other ways that I can bring just more pleasure into my life, so that food is one of the things that you get pleasure from, but it's not the only or the main, especially if that is getting the way of maybe some of your other health goals.
And also, like when it comes to food and pleasure, there's a reason why food activates the pleasure centers in our brain. And it's not because it's addictive.
Thank you. We need to talk about this. Yes.
Because eating is pleasurable, and especially if it's food that we enjoy. So instead of trying to make your meals perfect, Monday to Friday, these perfectly built meals, macros counted, all that kind of stuff, look at every meal as an opportunity for pleasure. That doesn't mean that it has to be only pleasure that you're thinking about, but I always think, what can I do to add pleasure, satisfaction? That might be a handful of chocolate chips in my oatmeal in the morning. I love hot sauces and chili crisps and things like that. So I have, always have some of that in the fridge so I can add some of that. So really just looking at meals throughout the day, every day, as an opportunity for pleasure so that you're not ending the day in a pleasure deficit. That's a huge part of avoiding that evening emotional hunger that so many, women especially feel is their problem. Like, I can't tell you, at least 3 times a week, I'll get an email or a message from someone who says, I eat really well during the day, but at night I can't keep my shit together.
Yeah.
And when I say, well, what does really good during the day look like? It often means either having no breakfast or a small breakfast, eating 100-calorie yogurt, not breakfast, folks, not breakfast. No. Not only breakfast.
For a grown woman, that's not for anyone really. That's not a breakfast.
Right.
Yeah.
Or there's no thought at all because of just busyness, not lack of, desire, but there's just kind of no planning or thought put into what they're eating. It's always just like, I'll figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
Like they leave the house not having eaten, coffee in hand, get to work, and sometimes don't even think about food until they're literally about to like punch someone because they're so hungry. And so when I phrase it to them that way, I'm like, well, does it make sense that you get home and at 8:00 when your kids are in bed or whatever, that you're just like, give me all the food? But it's just phrased so often as a problem with willpower,
Mm-hmm.
when really it's just a reaction to ending the day in a pleasure deficit.
I couldn't agree more. And going back to this idea that just like we don't let ourselves feel hunger, I also think we don't let ourselves or allow ourselves to feel pleasure. Like we think that that's like some nice thing to have in some distant future. No, you do need a regular daily dose of pleasure, because if you're not getting it elsewhere, your brain will go find it in your cupboard. Like it needs it.
So think about even just how we describe foods as guilty pleasures.
Mm-hmm.
We need to change that.
I know.
There's no guilt in finding food pleasurable.
There's a Michael Pollan quote that like really, I think, summarizes this. So he shows the word chocolate cake to a group of Americans, and their response is like guilt. Mm-hmm. And then he shows it to a group of people in France, and their association is celebration.
Yeah.
Same food, just totally different relationship.
Yeah.
Can we talk about one of the things that I heard you say, which I agree with, is that food is not addictive. And I think a lot of times part of what drives so many of these cravings is this idea that foods are addictive. And bread is a common one that patients are like, I can't eat bread because as soon as I eat bread, I want to eat the whole loaf. I'm addicted. So I just don't eat bread at all. So can you explain why that is not true and why actually restricting is probably what's driving some of these behaviors?
Yeah, this is my favorite myth to debunk. I love talking about this. Okay. So most of this came from rat studies that were done 30 years ago, where they gave rats access to Coca-Cola and access to cocaine, and they chose the Coca-Cola more often than the cocaine. That was the headline, and that is what has continued to be perpetuated in the media. What was not talked about was that in those studies, the rats who chose the Coca-Cola were rats who had it restricted to 1 hour a day. So the rats who had free access did not choose it more often. It was the rats who had it restricted. And there is quite a bit of other research to support the idea that it's the behavior of restriction that creates craving and not the food itself. What happens is that when we eat anything that we find enjoyable and pleasurable, or experience any other pleasure, the pleasure reward centers in our brain light up. That's also normal. Just because it's pleasurable doesn't mean it's addictive. And we need to stop equating that normal human response to enjoyable things as addictive, because just like other things, we're pathologizing something that's normal.
Yeah.
Drugs, alcohol, cocaine, all of those, and often prescription medications can hijack that reward pathway. And the levels of dopamine that are produced are much, much higher than can or should be, produced in a kind of a normal human pleasure response. And so what happens is that when they study the brains of people who eat something pleasurable, their reward centers do light up, but that doesn't mean that they're addicted. And the reason why that food addiction has not become part of the DSM and why it is not considered to be, a substance use disorder is that we don't see the symptoms of withdrawal, which are a key symptom component in that diagnosis of substance use disorder. And we also don't see people losing their jobs in their homes to support their bread habit, which we do see when people are suffering with a substance use disorder. And so what you're feeling isn't when you eat that bread, if anybody's listening and they're thinking, oh, no, but I am addicted because when I eat it, I can't stop. You've probably restricted it. Mm-hmm. And so when you do give in to that craving and allow yourself to have it, you need so much more to feel satisfied than if you had just had it when you wanted it. And because your brain is thinking, ooh, we're finally having this bread. I don't know when the next time I'm going to have this bread is. There's this need to eat so much more than we need to feel satisfied. So I try and tell people that satisfaction is an in-the-moment experience. You cannot save it up for later. And when you have unconditional permission to eat, so you can have bread at every meal every day if you would like, mm-hmm. you will not feel the urge to have all of it at once.
Yeah. It just becomes so much less interesting when you know that you can have it.
Yeah, it really does. Yeah. And lots of people will say foods that they felt addicted to, they don't even want anymore because they've allowed themselves to have as much of it. Mm-hmm. I had one story from a teacher that I think it's great to share about this. So she's a teacher, and as a result, at Christmas, she gets, I think she said something like 200 things of Ferrero Rocher, because everyone knows that she loves Ferrero Rocher. And so every student, every staff member, and this has always really stressed her out. And so every Christmas, it would just be like, okay, we just got to eat these to get them out of the house. And so this past Christmas, we'd been working together and, had been changing her thoughts around it. And when I saw her in February, she said that she still had tons of them in her cupboard and she had forgotten they were there. So when we remove the restriction, we remove the reward. And it just becomes something you can choose to have or something you can choose not to have.
Yeah. And I also think when you remove the restriction, you liberate so much mental and emotional energy, because the amount of mental space in most women's brains that is occupied by what to eat, what are the latest food rules, what am I allowed, what am I not allowed, when am I going to eat, it is exhausting. And I think this is one of the things I love most about intuitive eating is that when I am ready to eat, I literally walk down into my kitchen and I literally am just like, what do I feel like? Yeah. And that is such a liberating place to be. I don't spend my day thinking about what's for lunch, how many protein, how much. I just don't do that. And I want to spend my energy doing other things. So I really hope that one of the things that you take away from this episode is that we are using so much energy trying to restrict. And then we also waste so much energy feeling guilty and shamed when we eat the chocolate or the chips or whatever that emotional hunger is leading you to eat. So I really encourage you to start tuning in when you feel hungry, to ask that question, am I physically hungry? And if not, as Jenn suggests, just taking a pause. It's not a no, it's just a pause. And then you can decide, what do I actually need? And then using all the different tools in your toolbox to meet that need. And that may or may not include food. And if it does, it's perfectly okay.
Yeah, exactly. And, and just welcome, even just gratitude that food is part of your toolbox.
Oh, yes.
How often, do we find ourselves in a situation where the only thing that we can access is food, right? As a stress thing. So instead of feeling guilt and shame and anger, just to have a bit of gratitude for, hey, isn't it great that I have a favorite food that I can choose when I want it? Yeah. And again, just creating that space where you're out of the scarcity mindset around it. You're not using up head and heart space all the time to decide, have I exercised enough? Is it okay for me to have? Is this going to blow my diet? Am I you just let that go. And it just fits. It just fits.
I love that so much. More gratitude, less guilt, less shame, less energy spent around food. Jenn, thank you so much for being here. Are we going to be able to link to the roadmap in the show notes? Okay, so check out the show notes for the roadmap. It's such a great resource that summarizes what we've talked about today.
And if anyone, if I can just say, if anyone is interested, In my community, there's an entire roadmap that links to resources around that. So if people feel like, hey, this is really where I'm at, there's definitely some resources that I can help with too.
Wonderful. So we will link to where you can check out Jenn's Midlife Feast community and her podcast, and go follow her and sign up for her emails. They are really so helpful. You're welcome. Thank you for being here. Thanks for listening, everybody, and we will see you back here in 2 weeks. Thanks for spending your precious time with me today. If you enjoyed today's episode, it would mean so much to me if you would take a moment to leave us a rating and review, and share this episode with a friend who needs to hear it. If you're ready to get more insight into what's making you tired, find out which of the 5 most common types of fatigue you're dealing with by taking my fatigue fingerprint quiz at fatiguefixer.ca/quiz. Are you dealing with frazzled fatigue, where your body's exhausted but your brain won't shut up? Or maybe you're more of the drained fatigue type, where no matter how much sleep you get, you struggle to get up in the morning. Just take my fatigue fingerprint quiz and you'll have more insight into which labs to ask your doctor for and what habits and practices are best for fixing your type of fatigue. Find the quiz at fatiguefixer.ca/quiz. Because let's face it, accepting perpetual exhaustion as the norm, that's just not going to fly around here. Last but not least, I want to thank Jen Hudson and Mike Trutler over at Story Studio Network for bringing these conversations to life. I'll see you right back here in 2 weeks. Bye.